He was a morbidly obese surgeon destined for an operating table and an early death. Now he's a rebel MD who is fabulously fit and fighting to make America healthy again. This is Stay Off My Operating Table with Dr. Philip Ovadia.
Welcome, folks. It is Stay Off My Operating Table with Dr. Philip Ovadia. We are joined today by Dr. Kien Vuu, who Phil met in a pretty cool way. I don't have to say any more right now, Phil. Take it away.
All right. Yeah, excited to have Ken on with us. Ken and I met a few weeks ago at the RFK Make America Healthy Again inaugural ball in Washington, D.C., which was an awesome event that we'll certainly talk a little bit about. I had actually seen some stuff online that Ken had been doing prior to that. So it was pretty cool that we got to meet up in person. And I said, I got to have you on my podcast. And actually, yesterday we recorded for Ken's podcast. So we'll link to that so people can go check that out as well. And just excited to get your story out here. Why don't you introduce yourself to the audience, Ken? Kind of talk a little bit about your background, maybe what got you into health in the first place, and then maybe we'll talk about how you underwent a similar transformation that I did and are sort of seeing the problems with the healthcare system.
Yeah, so great meeting another soul, meeting somebody who's gone through the conventional medical route, and certainly seeing maybe some limitations as to, that form of practice and maybe how we were trained. My background is an interventional radiologist, and for people who don't know, there's radiology or diagnostic radiology, which is the use of energy, ultrasound energy, magnetic resonance energy, X-rays to pierce inside the body to look at the human body. And so we study the entire anatomy and know what normal anatomy looks like in abnormal anatomy. But I'm an interventional radiologist, and so that subspecialty uses the imaging to perform minimally invasive procedures. And so we would go into blood vessels, we would open them if they were clogged, we would close blood vessels that were bleeding. We can actually pierce inside the body. So if there was an abnormal growth, we could guide a needle in to sample it and also maybe burn it or freeze it. So really cool medicine. And as a diagnostic radiologist, certainly we knew what disease states were and how they manifested in the body. But even with that plethora of knowledge, I would probably say maybe 5 years in, when I was first an attending doctor, I was in a big tertiary care facility, and then I went into private practice, and my life was just hustling. How do I become more prominent in my field? How do I get more patients? How do I go around the world speaking on the, advances in interventional radiology? I become chief of interventional radiology in my hospital. And then a year that broke me was also potentially, the biggest gift because it allowed me to wake up to how I was living my life. And how I was living my life actually gave me disease because that year I was overweight, I was diabetic, I had a hemoglobin A1C of 7. I had high blood pressure and I was on several prescription medications. And had I continued along the path and bought into the story that this is just going to happen in my life, that ultimately I'll probably need to increase the doses of my medications, need to take more medications, I was going to end up in my own interventional radiology suite at some point going down that path. And I remember that very same year, I lost somebody I thought I was going to marry because I was never present in our relationship. I lost a close uncle to cancer, and I also tore a labrum in my shoulder. And during the repair process, I was told I might not be able to operate anymore. And so it really allowed me to look at my life. And what I did at that point was I left full-time medicine and I started to look at alternate ways of people that have actually healed themselves. And there were, these amazing, miraculous stories of people reversing disease. And they were in the biohacking space, they were in the integrative medicine space, they were in the functional medicine space. And so I did an additional training in anti-aging longevity medicine with the American Academy of Anti-Aging. And so much of that was lifestyle medicine. And within a very short period of time, I just changed the way I ate, I changed the way I slept, I changed the way I moved. And within 6 months, I reversed everything. And then I dove in more into the space and I started to, started to study people, read the book, The Blue Zones, and I, know that there were people around the planet that were consistently living a longer time. Now, the studies that are there are not really true epidemiological studies. I mean, but they had these patterns of how people were living life. And it actually correlated with living a longer life. And these things were what we ate, how we slept, whether or not we felt connected with a tribe and a community, whether or not we felt like we were connected to something much bigger, whether we're serving more of ourselves or whether we're just stressed out living for ourselves. And I questioned whether these behaviors translated to biological changes. And so I studied epigenetics and I started to study, gene expression of people with those behaviors. And it turns out that those behaviors, and now we actually have the tests that actually look at the epigenetic clocks of people with these type of behaviors, but how we live our life, particularly in those areas, actually shifts our biology and how we live our life is medicine. And I'll break there, but it was basically an entire wake-up call as to how I was living life, which was a very unconscious way about how I was approaching life and how I was chasing success to make myself feel worthy, to a process of rediscovering who I am, who I'm meant to be, how I'm connected to something much bigger, and living in a way that's serving me and treating every single cell with love and that actually reversed disease, and I've also biologically aged backwards.
Yeah, awesome. And a bunch of amazing things you touched on there that we want to talk a little bit deeper about. But I first want to ask, we've had uh, I don't know how many physicians on this show at this point who have gone through a similar journey, right? And they're in medicine and they're, doing the grind and they're just sort of, you know, kind of doing what they were told, right? What they were taught to do. And then something happens. Usually it's their own health. In some cases, it's a patient that kind of amazes them and wakes them up. And they realize that so much of what we thought was true is not. And, that we're not really being taught how to make people healthy. We're being taught how to take care of sick people and that's our focus in the healthcare system. So when you started to kind of recognize that, talk a little bit about what your thought process was, why, and what always kind of, I would say, fascinates me is so many of our colleagues are doing the same thing and they don't come to this realization. So, what is it about you, about us that do come to this realization? What do you think is different that allows our colleagues or would allow our colleagues to kind of wake up and see this?
Unfortunately, there's so much noise in the world right now that unless you are given, circumstances in your own life where you're in a state of fear or pain, it's hard to make changes. It's really hard to wake up unless you're slapped with life is not working for you. And, I talk a little bit about the wake up process, so I would attribute, so much of disease as just not being conscious. And I'd like to, maybe even go back to, a little bit about, I'd like to talk a little bit about neuroscience and the default mode network and then talk about my upbringing because I think people would probably, resonate with certain parts of the story to see if they're really truly living their life consciously or are they playing an old program. Neuroscientists are beginning to learn more about a part of the brain called the default mode network. It's a very primitive part of our brain and nervous system that's tied to our amygdala, which is our fear center, and our hippocampus, our memory centers. And when we were young, the default mode network is just like a sponge and it downloads information from our parents, from our teachers, from society, from social media. It just takes on all this programming. And because it's our default survival and fear center, it's constantly looking for what can hurt us. And because it's tied to our amygdala and hippocampus, it remembers our past traumas. As human beings, the things that probably hurt us most, particularly when we're so vulnerable as children, is not being loved, not feeling safe, and not being connected. And so as a child, if you don't feel any of those things, we would start to adopt certain behaviors. Oh, I can't be myself. I need to be this way to get love, or I need to do this to feel connected. And so there are these layers of inauthentic ways of being that become our ego, and it becomes the seat of our. And so for me, growing up, I was Chinese, born in Vietnam, left on a boat after the Vietnam War, was on the boat for 8 months in a Philippine refugee camp for 3 months. And then we were sponsored by a Catholic church, and I grew up in Chinatown, LA. Growing up, I was constantly being teased. Didn't see anyone that looked like me on TV. In fact, there were caricatures of Asian people and men. And so I grew up not feeling like I was enough. I felt like I wasn't worthy. And I think many of us probably experienced some form of that growing up as a child. And for me, I my ego was like, hey, you know what? I need something outside of myself. I need to become this thing and I need XYZ for me to feel loved. And that's why I went to the best medical schools. That's why I strove to do well in school. That's why I tried to create this personality that was likable. But this was an ego and this was a mask that I was wearing. And so when the default mode is on, it basically thinks that you're constantly in danger. And my friend over at UCLA, Stephen Cole, he's a researcher on epigenetics and the social effects, and he studies psychoneuroimmunobiology. And when we're in that state, it basically turns on a gene complex called the conserved transcriptional response to adversity, which is basically the stress and danger response. And so in that consciousness, inflammatory genes are upregulated, which means when we think we're in danger, when we're in that fear mode, it turns on inflammation. Why? Because back in the Paleolithic days, if a saber-toothed tiger or a neighboring village is about to attack you, you might get a flesh wound. Let's protect the body by turning on inflammation. And it decreases your immune genes. Why is that? Why expend your body's energy on fighting infections and cancer when you're about to be someone's lunch? But in that consciousness of not feeling like I was enough, not feeling like I was loved, I was constantly hustling. I needed to achieve success. And in that mode, I was basically living as if there was a saber-toothed tiger I was constantly running from. And ultimately, it gave every single cell in my body that I was in danger, which turned on the inflammatory genes that basically brought down the immunity genes. And what we do know is those combination of things basically causes our cells not to function very well. And those ultimately lead to insulin resistance, metabolic syndrome. And then, depending on what part of the body is most affected, we start labeling them with different diseases when the root causes is how we're living our life. I probably got off on a tangent there, but
No, it was awesome. I mean, it kind of bring a different aspect to this conversation around, what is it about how we're living our lives that, ends up presenting as the diseases. And again, I think all too often, the issue in medicine today is we're just focused on the disease, right? And we're not thinking about what led to it, what caused it, and how can we address those factors. And certainly this constant state of hypervigilance or stress, whatever you want to call it, is a major contributor for so many people we see these days.
yeah, absolutely. The way I want to let people understand health is, who are we as a human organism? We're basically cells that get together, work together to form tissues, work together to form organs, work together to form organ systems that all work together to form the human body. And for us to have health and for us to live a long time and for us to be at peak performance, it all comes down to the health of our cells. But what controls the health of our cells? Back in the day, we used to think that our genetics determined our cellular health. Mom had diabetes, dad had diabetes, therefore I have diabetes because it's in our genes. Well, that's not the case. That's not how our cells work. Our genes are just a blueprint, but how this blueprint gets played out and manifests out in life is our cells are constantly listening to the energetic environment around it. There's hormones, neurotransmitters. There's even energy that might not be able to be measured now that changes how our genes are expressed. So that determines cellular health. So are we conscious of the energetic environment? Are we conscious of the epigenome we are feeding ourselves? Because ultimately, it is optimal cells that lead to optimal tissues, that lead to optimal organs, that now lead to optimal systems that give us optimal health, longevity, and peak performance. So are we conscious of the way we're living life? And in that fear mode of I'm not worthy, I'm not enough, I need to succeed, I became the poster child of the famous Dalai Lama quote when he was asked what he found most interesting about humanity. He said, man, because he would sacrifice his health in order to make money and then sacrifice his money to recuperate his health. And eating the junk food, not sleeping very well, thinking that I need to prioritize work over, prioritize working out. All these choices I was making unconsciously from that fear and survival mode. So it took waking up to that process, being a little bit more conscious of the energy or the energetic signals I'm giving to my cells. And just to break it down so that people, have a framework for this, there are five things that most affect the epigenome of our cells. One is in the physical realm, which includes sleep, nutrition, and movement. Then there are, then there is mental, the thoughts that we think of, or the thoughts that we focus on actually contribute to this energetic environment. What we feel or our emotions also contribute to that. Our community. Are we serving our community? Do we feel like we're connected to something much bigger, or do we feel alone? Because that loneliness actually drives disease as well. And finally, that sense of purpose, that sense of are we truly living as the authentic versions of us and serving the people around us, or are we living for ourselves and not? You know what? The human body is a blueprint of how I think humanity should be behaving as well. Every single cell in the human body, you've got a heart cell that basically has a lot of striated muscle to be able to contract. You've got lungs with alveoli that are able to facilitate in gas exchange. Each has their unique purpose, but they're not acting for themselves. They're doing this so that every single cell can actually receive the benefits of them existing. And that's how we should be as humanity and potentially as a nation. But, I think both you and I were very inspired to attend the Maha inaugural ball because I think, we are now trying to unite towards this movement. But, I have to say that America and the world is sick. There are versions of cancer in America and the world, and there's versions of autoimmune disease in America and the world as well.
Yeah, talk about, how you kind of view that differently now than you did, back before you sort of had this transformation.
Yeah, I mean, before I had this transformation, I would probably say very asleep to life. I was this version of myself that didn't think I was enough, and I was running off this program of these are the things that I needed in life to be happy, to feel good. And then when I had all of those things, when I had the car, when I had the house, when I went around the world, speaking on the technologies of interventional radiology, I was the sickest I've ever been. And I would probably say waking up to the beauty of life, waking up to recognize, oh, wow, I can really be a little bit more conscious about how I live my life and how I live my life and how I feel about life and whether or not I feel alive, whether or not I feel connected with other people. Those things are medicines as well. So don't get me wrong, I'm really excited about all the technology we have in the stem cell space with artificial intelligence, with organ regrowth. There's a lot of technology that is allowing us to live longer. But at the end of the day, I still, I've got one of my favorite phrases that you are your best medicine because how you live your life, how you see life, how you participate in life is one of the most beautiful and most empowering things that we can do. And I think that's one of the things you and I both agree on. Like, no matter what is happening in our political sphere, we are ultimately in control of our health.
Yeah, definitely. And I think one of my takeaways from the Maha event and from the Maha movement and just so people have a frame of reference as we're recording this, Robert F. Kennedy has an imminent vote to hopefully be approved to become the new Secretary of Health and Human Services. And hopefully he's going to be able to, push forward an agenda or a focus on health within the agenda of the, new administration, and we're all very optimistic about that. And the event we were at was an amazing kind of celebration and seeing all the people that are enthusiastic about this. But we're not going to sit back and wait for, the government to do this. And I think a lot of the messaging that both you and I, focus on is each individual needs to take charge of their health and needs to, make changes that will lead them to better health. You went through your own health transformation and you did these things that, as probably, in your education, right, you didn't even know were possible, right? Getting off of medications for high blood pressure, reversing diabetes. What do you, I guess, talk a little bit about what you're doing now to help people, to help spread this message, and even just how you talk to family and friends around health these days.
I mean, tell them basically that health is ultimately in our hands, that how we live our life is medicine. And I try to make things simple for people, which are basically five pillars: the physical, mental, emotional, social, and spiritual aspects. And are we conscious of the choices that we're making in each one of these areas of life? The environment does make a big difference. What's in our food supply, whether or not there's viruses and other things that are around there that are lurking. And those are things maybe we can't control, or maybe, yes, maybe we can move to areas that don't have those toxins, etc. But you could be conscious about these five areas of life. And one is understanding that. And I think the other aspect of it is a little bit kind of spiritual as well. Are you conscious of the version of yourself that's making those choices or not? And then being able to see, oh, wow, there is a version of myself that is in stress mode. Where did that come from? And it's doing actually a lot of the deeper, inner child work, and healing some of these traumas that allow some of the choices, that we can make in day-to-day life a lot easier, because that eliminates a little bit of the root cause as well. I mean, some people are like, oh, I didn't realize that healing childhood traumas. But if we look at the famous ACEs study, which is a study based out of UCSF that looked at adverse childhood experiences. And they listed out these childhood experiences as divorce in the family, drugs in the family, abuse, neglect, etc. And the more traumatic events that they had as children, the more chronic diseases, whether it be cancer, autoimmune disease, hypertension, was increased in these people with, adverse childhood events. Now, these are big T traumas, but, I didn't live in a family that had big T traumas, but there were versions of myself that didn't feel seen, didn't feel heard, didn't feel loved in some capacity, didn't feel like I could be my authentic self. And those smaller things as well are different versions of traumas that created a version of myself that was not conscious about how I was living my life. And so doing some of that work, I think, and giving light to some of that work, I think is very important, because it allows us to make choices easier. Because sometimes it's, that the chocolate cake is bad, but it's like there's a part of you that just kind of wants to dive in there. But it's like, what is that? Why do you feel that urge? Why do you feel that pain? Is there some emotional, there's something going on emotionally that you don't need to address, and the chocolate cake is just so easy to reach for. That's the next layer. It's like, one, understand that we can consciously make choices in five areas of life that can completely change your health around. And then two, are there some underlying wounds and traumas that you can address to be able to make choices easier for you in life?
I want to check. Is my mic working yet?
Yep, you're good now.
This, the, I can't tell whether it's spiritual or emotional or mental stress that I'm dealing with today. Um, but I want to throw my computer right through the window. Um, it'd be it would be cool to take what you said about you used what really sounds like a cliche, doing the inner child work. My experience is that people who've actually dealt with some of their internal garbage in a way that people for whom it's only a theory can't. So I would love for you to expand on that, how those things that you dealt with in your beliefs cascaded into your physical health. And my guess is probably vice versa.
Yeah, well,
Physical impacted the emotional and the mental and the spiritual.
yeah, yeah. Thank you for that question. I'll speak from kind of my own personal experience, and then we can maybe expand that and extrapolate that. Growing up as a child, I had parents that, you know, also had a lot. Another thing we could talk about later on is basically epigenetic transference. But basically, the traumas that our parents had actually transfer over to us if we don't heal them. And I could talk about the science of how that happens as well.
And that's not, it's important to point out to our audience that this is not merely you feel bad because your parents felt bad. This
Yeah.
actually has a physical component to it that has been traced.
Yes. So let's talk about that first, get that out of the way. There were studies in on mice, and what they did was they did these experiments where they took these male mice and they exposed them to the smell of cherries. And in doing so, they also shocked the mice. And they kept doing it. Smell a cherry, shock the mice. Smell a cherry, shock the mice. Where basically they got these mice trained in such a way where eventually there was just the smell of cherries without a shock and they started to quiver. Okay. Interesting thing is they took these mice, male mice, and they bred them. And two generations down, what would happen is you've got these mice that never been exposed to the shock or the cherries. Eventually, they exposed them to the smell of cherries and they would quiver as well. And these were mice that were never exposed to the actual trauma of the shock. But basically, that energetic trauma that happened in their grandfathers changed their biology in such a way that went into their genes that got passed down the generations. This is why there was a great famine in Denmark years ago, and they started to look at their offspring and how they were more susceptible to be getting diabetes because, their whole generation at that time during the famine, they had to, survive off of very little nutrition. You put that family now that has those change, epigenetics to somebody who's got food plethora, and all of a sudden they're more prone to get diabetes. And so we see these things happening, and there are different versions of traumas that get passed down to us. And what happens is some of these things are actually, if you get some trauma, they'll start to make tags in your DNA that changes how gene gets expressed. Sometimes those tags could be removed. These are methylation tags. Sometimes they get removed. Other times it's not about removing the tag itself, but it's like forming a new pathway so that, you can heal around that. So you change your genetic expression in such a way where you're not necessarily removing a physical tag, but your cells still perform in such a way that doesn't necessarily silence that one particular gene.
And I think it's important to note that this epigenetic mutation goes in both directions. It's not merely that if something bad happened to your grandfather, your genes are going to express that as well. It can also be that if your grandfather developed some sort of positive traits that actually flow down into the DNA, those also can be passed along. So this is not it's not a one-way journey to oblivion when it comes to epigenetics.
Yeah, absolutely. And this is why doing the work of maybe releasing some of those things. And, when we change the way we live our life, if we could remove some of those old patterns, and like for those mice, if those mice actually had a consciousness, which they do, but, if they're like, oh, you know what? Let me do some deep internal work. Maybe the smell of cherries has no negative effect on me. And they start to unravel some of that and release some of the energy, the stored energy there. They could start to create new pathways where that effect of the smell of cherries isn't, so strong. And that's basically the work of healing that we're all doing.
And do we have, kind of demonstration of that? Because, I think all too often, right, genetics turns into this, someone thinks that, whatever is kind of predetermined by their genetics, and we can't change that, why try and fight it, right? I'm destined to be obese. All my family was obese. And so I'm not really going to try to eat healthy, eat healthier or exercise more because I can't overcome this. So kind of talk about how you view that, and especially with maybe epigenetics being a little different than genetics on that
Yeah.
front.
So let's talk about a little bit more about the word epigenetics, right? So epi means above, and then genetics genes. So this is above the genes. And so basically, what makes the phenotype of a cell, or how does a cell behave, or what's the state of a cell? Basically, cells are a mixture of basically a bunch of organelles, and organelles are made of different type of proteins, etc. And so what makes a cell a specific cell are in that particular cell, you have a certain amount of genes that are turned on that basically creates this protein that makes the cell what it is. But what controls the turning of genes? Back in the day, they were like, okay, these genes just kind of turn on themselves and they'll just do their own work. That's not the case. So the DNA is just the blueprint. It's just kind of like your recipe book. If you got a recipe book, what's for dinner? The recipe book doesn't just make what's for dinner. It's no, somebody has to come in and go, oh, okay, I'm going to pick this page or this page and we'll make this and make that. And depending on the chef, in terms of who they are, they see the recipe book and they'll make their dish a little bit differently. And that's basically how things are expressed or how the cells ends up being expressed. So yes, things are inherited that will create disease, but it's not the genes that are inherited that's creating the disease. It's the epigenome, how they are living your life. So if you're living and you see, mom and dad constantly fighting, constantly yelling at each other, and this is how you treat people, and they're just shoving down processed foods to numb themselves or to feel better, and they're like constantly hustling at work trying to make ends meet, and they're not sleeping very well, all these things, that's the epigenome. That's what gets passed down. The thought, the behaviors, the emotions that become the energetic signals that go down to our genes. So can we be conscious of that? And going back to Jack, my own personal things, growing up in an immigrant family that felt like I should be a certain way versus not fitting in America. I didn't feel like I belonged in any sense, and there were parts of me that never really truly felt love from my parents or that I truly fit in the schools. And so I transformed and I morphed myself and I need to be this.
And it'd be good to point out uh, that a tremendous amount of the emotional baggage that we all carry comes from this very short period of life where most people don't feel like they belong. Even the people who belong as deeply as belonging can happen,
Yeah.
adolescence, we all feel this. And then if you layer on top of it genuine outsider status like
Yeah.
you had, it's really kind of a wonder that human beings are not more screwed up. I
This
didn't mean
is
to interrupt
all,
you, but
yeah, no. And I love the fact that you said that. And I think there's almost this spiritual lesson for us to be able to come back to who we are. And it's almost a gift for us to forget who we are. But, I mentioned just some of my traumas, but now you can imagine you extrapolate that to families that are broken, families that have abuse, families that have dealt with drugs and all these different things, and what it actually does to your nervous system and your consciousness. And then now add, oh, this is why they're choosing the processed foods. This is why they're not sleeping. This is why. And so these are all unconscious choices. And sometimes when you talk to these people and say, oh, these are the changes you need to make, and they're not making them, it's these deep rooted ways of looking at life that make it so hard. And so that's why you have to do the deeper work, which is definitely a secondary, it's a next level of work that we need to do to remember ourselves. And I think,
have you seen examples of people who do the work at the physical level, and because of that, they start uncovering and unpacking some demons maybe that are buried down in the basement.
Yeah.
Does it, what I'm asking is, does the healing flow the other direction?
Yes. Everything is all energetically connected. And so when you do certain things that start to change the energy that you're giving to your cells, you also, like, for example, if you were to just sleep better, all of a sudden you're going to start feeling better. You have better emotions, right? You'll have better energy to be able to, focus your attention on things that you have versus things that you don't have. You can focus on the things you control versus not control. So you're better able to make conscious choices in that place. You're also better to be around as a person and attract people. And then you also feel like, hey, you know what? I'm feeling pretty good. I have more to give. You can see how these are all energetically connected. You make one change and it changes everything else. So for me, I started off physical. I started off with sleep, nutrition, movement. But as I started to do that, I started to recognize, oh, I could be a little bit more conscious about how I'm making choices. I'm a little bit more aware of, oh, is this a reaction from something that's within me? And how do I better respond? And so, yes, it flows in all directions. And so everything is energetically connected. And right now, I would probably say where I was before when I had disease was basically an energetic state of being that made all the choices, all the decisions very unconscious that created disease in my body. But any shift in any one of these things can start to lift up the energetic frequency of the entire system. So it makes it easier for you to make different changes as you go. And it's an ongoing process. I am still, healing every single day.
Yeah, no, it is amazing how often we see this and people come to us, right? And, so for me, it's I have heart disease and I have diabetes. And, we start talking about different, oftentimes it's the dietary strategies first and they start eating better. And, yes, the diabetes gets better and goes away. And the heart disease, stops getting worse and maybe gets better. But it also often they then, so much in their life changes, right? And, one of the things that has been sort of fascinating is seeing how people's addictive behaviors change, right? And you can talk about, okay, maybe food is an addictive behavior, and it is for many people. But many people start this journey, right? And, things like whatever it is, gambling, porn, smoking, those addictions start to melt away and and it's not obvious at first why. How does fixing your diabetes and lowering your blood sugar all of a sudden make you, and we oftentimes talk about a lot of people talk about the inflammation in the brain, or that the brain isn't on this sugar roller coaster anymore, and that kind of stabilizes things. But I think there's very real component to what you're talking about, right? This kind of whole body energetic change and the epigenetic things that are going on, under the radar, that are contributing to those behavioral changes as well.
Yeah.
It sounds like you might, I'm sorry, my voice did that thing. It sounds like you might have some familiarity with Dr. Joe Dispenza's work.
Oh, yeah, definitely. Uh,
Now, I have to confess, it's really cool to run into somebody who's an actual medical doctor who is saying these things that folks like Dr. Joe have been saying for the last few years. And it's fascinating to me that that we're finally making the connection between how we think, how we behave, and how it affects us at at the level of ourselves.
No, I
Um,
mean, there is more and more, and it's easier to do as a medical doctor now, only because now we have better tools to be able to actually study what's happening at the cellular level. But, these practices have been around for a really long time. Um, Now we're actually being able to study the fact that everything is energy, and some energy we can measure better than others. We have more physical markers, but some energies we don't measure as well, but there's definitely an effect. We were just studying, there's a big research collaborative coming out of UCSF and Columbia, a guy by the name of Martin Picard, who studies basically emotional states and what emotional states have to do with our mitochondrial health. And so they studied these women over the course of several weeks, and they had these women mark their emotional states throughout the day from being either feeling resentful, angry, glad, sad versus feeling loved, feeling connected, etc. And there was no surprise that the people that reported more negative states of feeling that they actually had a lower mitochondrial health index versus people that felt joy, love, connection, etc. And so this is more
Well,
proof.
now, what is a mitochondrial health index? What's that mean? The
Yeah.
reason I ask is because oftentimes I hear these research studies that seem to come up with findings that any average guy with an average IQ knows are true. Happy people tend to be more successful. Research proves it. But you used a phrase there, mitochondrial health index,
Yeah.
which implies that maybe we looked at something under a microscope or something and we could see that, oh, yeah, there is actually a difference at the cellular level. So
Yeah. So
would you expand on that?
so mitochondrial health index is they basically take several reactions of the mitochondria, like look at redox potentials. So basically, they look at different parameters of mitochondrial health, and they'll like basically test it to see if this is a good functioning mitochondrial or not. Now, there's actually different ways of measuring mitochondrial health, and I don't want to go deep in the weeds of the science, but it basically, the mitochondria perform, I don't know, gosh, like hundreds of things for the body, including not only energy production, which is what it's known for, but hormone production, killing cells off through apoptosis, senescent cells, etc. So it's not only the major like energy production factory of the cell, but it also controls where are you sending your energy. Are you sending your energy towards the immune system? Are you sending your energy towards inflammation? So it's a big conductor. And if and there are different ways of measuring the health by measuring all the different processes, and mitochondrial health index is just one way of measuring it. But it's what we're also starting to find is now with epigenetic testing that basically looks at methylation markers on your genome, we could start to see like changes of your epigenetics as you're, making these behavioral, lifestyle, mental, and emotional changes. That's really fascinating. And I know a researcher at UCSD, Hemal Patel, doing a lot of Dr. Joe's work, who basically saw these people post-conference, measured their microbiome and saw some improvement and better diversity of the microbiome after that experience. And they've got a different version of being able to measure mitochondrial health, but they've also demonstrated that mitochondrial health improves after a week of doing like deep meditation as well. And at the end of the day, what I'm basically suggesting, and I don't want to sound too woo, is that we're all energetic beings. There's a bioenergy to basically how the entire ecosystem of the body works. And the cell basically is a antenna. And basically how the cell works is like, what's the energy around it? How are you feeding this? And so if you've got a good environment around that cell, this cell is going to grow, this cell is going to thrive. If you give the signals of danger, the cell's like, oh, we're in stress mode now. Everybody, we're under attack right now. We're under attack. Let's turn on inflammation. So that's how we're being. So if we start to understand that, we're like, oh, if we're doing the meditative being, if we're a little bit more aware of the default mode, maybe these old programmings, these old triggers that puts us in emotions of anger, of resentment, of stress, if we could be more aware and we're doing that work, Dr. Joe has a book, You Are the Placebo. By what you believe, by what you focus on, you're changing the energetic environment of your cells and you're changing gene expression.
You just said, humans are energetic beings, right? And I want to go back to the first couple of minutes of this episode. When you were describing, your training as a radiologist, you described radiology in a different way than I've ever heard it be described. And you said we're using energy to show us, the inner workings and what's going on in the body. And I'm guessing that's not maybe how you thought of radiology, as you were going through the training. But I'd love to hear you kind of expand on that.
No, when I chose radiology because, I thought it was, you know, in medicine, we have residencies back in the day where, there were lifestyle residency called the Road to Happiness or the Road to Success, which included radiology, ophthalmology, anesthesia, and dermatology. CT
Huh.
surgery wasn't a part of the Road of Success, by the way.
No, definitely not.
And so,
This is some real good inside baseball stuff here for all us non-medical people. We're like, yep, we thought so. But here we've got a couple of guys who know who are confirming. Okay, anyway.
it's really neat to be able to see the work that I'm doing now and start to understand what's happening there because what we are using in radiology is basically looking to see how the body interacts with some energetic signal for us to be able to see an image, you know? And recently I gave a talk to a group of radiologists that were like, we see signs of cirrhosis, which means nodules in the liver. What we don't fail to see just yet is the consciousness and the trauma of the person that has the drink that start to form these nodules that are around the body. But the deeper we start to understand the energetics of the entire body, I think we'll better understand why anatomy is, why certain things look the way they do when I start to see the image of someone. So now when I look at an image of someone and I see cirrhosis and I see in their lungs, um, emphysema or their lungs are very narrow and I start to see, some nodules of cancer. I'm like, what is the trauma? What is this person going through that's causing this entire system? He must not be eating well. Yes, he's smoking. Yes, he's drinking. But, what are all those things that are underlying this process? So it's really neat to be able to start to see. But the energetic impetus that drive the entire ecosystem that formed this person that was a cirrhotic, which means have a very fibrotic liver or very fibrous liver and very thin lungs. The energetic things are maybe some of these traumas that are creating the consciousness that is making choices, that is creating a state where every cell feels like they're in danger, that creates inflammation, that now physically creates these diseases in the body. So where then are the root causes? And that's where we start to talk about. And that's why I said the first layer is understanding those five things that we can kind of control. And the things that we're like, oh man, I just can't, I still keep doing this thing, or it's so hard for me to make this new choice. What's driving that? And so much of it is doing that deeper inner energetic junk trauma work that was so powerful for me. So my entrance to this was working on the physical, but deeply, as I move through, I recognize that everything is energy in our body and all contributes to our genetic expression.
That is deep.
Yeah, this has
I
been
want to I want to have a whole nother
This is a power
podcast
scribe
series.
mic for dictation, and I'm going to drop it. It's there. Mic
there
drop.
you go. No, this has been an awesome conversation, and certainly one we're going to have to circle back and have part two on. But for all the people out there who want to get some more of your energy into their lives, which I'm sure they want to, tell them how they can connect with you and find you.
Yeah, I mean, I'm all over social media at Dr. VMD. That's doctor spelled out DOCTOR VMD. And visit the work that I do with corporations or keynote speaking at kienvuu.com. That's KIENVUU.com.
I love that last name. I realize you didn't have any choice in it, but that's a really cool last name.
Thank you.
Front name's good too, but the last name is, oh boy. All right, this has been Stay Off My Operating Table with Dr. Philip Ovadia. Our guest has been Dr. Kien Vuu, and all the contact information will be available in the show notes. Thanks for joining us, and we'll talk to you all next time.
Chances are you wouldn't be listening to this podcast if you didn't need to change your life and get healthier. So take action right now. Book a call with Dr. Ovadia's team. One small step in the right direction is all it takes to get started. Contact us at ifixhearts.com/talk. That's ifixhearts.com/talk.